Okay, I'm going to give a fairly high-level framework for trying to understand the question of how might we explain consciousness scientifically. I'm going to try and look at what are the easy problems of consciousness and what are the hard problems. What kind of explanation doesn't work in explaining consciousness? What kind of explanation might work? I'm going to try and give a framework for perhaps understanding what's going to be going on in some of the later papers in this conference and what kind of things they might and might not be achieving. And towards the end I might outline my own preferred approach to giving a kind of a scientific theory of consciousness. So if we can move on to the next slide. The term consciousness is very ambiguous, as everybody knows. It means a whole lot of things. It refers to a whole lot of phenomena. Some of those phenomena are really quite easy to explain relatively. Some of them are quite hard. So to move straight to the center of the problem, I think by far the hardest and most interesting problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. Right? What, in a sense, why it is that some physical systems are systems that are subjects of experience, that have what Tom Nagel calls something that is like to be that system. For instance, why is it that, for instance, we have experience, visual experience or auditory experiences, the quality of red, which Abendolden was referring to, the sensation of middle C, mental images, or the qualitative aspect of emotion. How is it that any physical system could be a subject of experience in this sense? This is what some philosophers call qualia, and some, as Owen Flanagan is saying, call phenomenology or phenomenal consciousness. Or just to disambiguate this, I'll call this a problem of conscious experience. Now, to contrast with these, if you can move up maybe a little bit, there's a whole lot of a whole lot of different senses of consciousness, in which consciousness is in many ways a much easier problem. The term consciousness or conscious is sometimes used for states that are reportable, for our ability to report certain mental states, or to have introspective access to certain facts about us. We have mechanisms that can access internal mental states and report them. We can control our behavior in deliberate ways. We have a certain concept of the self. We have access to facts about the world and knowledge of the world. This is sometimes the term consciousness is used in that very broad sense. Sometimes the term consciousness is used for the distinction between just being awake and being asleep. Now, there's not really an issue about whether these things can be explained scientifically. If this is what the term consciousness was being used to refer to, it just wouldn't really be much of a problem. I mean, these are hard problems and interesting problems, but in their way. But it's pretty non-controversial, I think, that these things can be explained by giving some kind of fairly straightforward mechanistic account involving the right kind of processes within a cognitive model that access information about the world, certain mechanisms and devices for monitoring one's own states and reporting them, and so on. These seem to be paradigm problems that are accessible to the methods of cognitive science straightforwardly. And in this sense of consciousness, consciousness is analogous to problems like learning and memory. I don't want to demean these too much by calling them easy. I mean, problems like learning and memory aren't easy either. They'll probably take a century or two of cognitive science to work out. But there's a sense in which the problems there are technical details, and they don't contain the deep mystery which is contained in the first sense, the experiential sense of consciousness. I think that's probably what we here are really the most interested in. It's interesting to actually look sometimes at what both philosophers and scientists do when they're talking about consciousness or writing a paper on consciousness. They'll start their paper by talking about the mysteries of consciousness in the first sense, and what is it like? Okay, how can we have a theory of this? Then they go on to outline their theory of consciousness in the second half of the paper, and it very frequently turns out to be a theory of one of the easy things, reportability or introspective access and so on. And they say, well, see, consciousness isn't such a hard problem after all. We can have a theory. I think you have to watch out for this kind of bait and switch. Next slide. The reason I think why these easy problems are easy is precisely because they concern the explanation of certain of our abilities or capacities or functions, functionally definable capacities. And for this kind of problem, all we need to explain them is to outline a kind of mechanism a mechanism that will perform the function in question, such as a mechanism that leads to verbal reports, a mechanism for accessing certain internal contents and reporting them in behavior, a mechanism for discriminating information about the world, and so on. Now, in fact, I think if you look throughout science, and particularly throughout productive explanation of higher level phenomena in science in terms of low level phenomena, you see that most explanation is like this. If you move it up some. Further? Maybe further. You see, for instance, when people explain genes in terms of DNA, what's given, right, is a mechanism, an explanation of a mechanism by which hereditary characteristics and hereditary information can be transmitted from one generation to another. And that's basically the problem of explaining genes. It's a problem of explaining how that function, the transmission of hereditary information, can be performed. Explain the performance of that function, and you've explained what there is to explain about genes. There's no further question. I think the same goes for problems in cognitive science, such as learning and memory. To explain learning, what you need to do is explain sort of how there are certain mechanisms that lead to increases in improvements in adaptive behavior in response to various novel environmental situations that improve our ability to deal with those situations. Explain that mechanism, and you explain learning. Next slide. I think the hard problem, the problem of experience, really is a hard problem precisely because it's not a problem of explaining functions. It seems to me that you can explain all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of consciousness, such as discrimination, categorization, introspection, report, and so on, and it can still remain completely unanswered. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why is the mechanical system that's doing this a subject of experience? This seems to be a further question and a different kind of question that theories of performance of these functions just doesn't come to grips with. The usual methods of cognitive science, computational modeling, neuroscience, and so on just don't seem to suffice for answering this question. Incidentally, I'm not denying here that I'm not really even addressing the question that Owen Flanagan raised of whether in fact consciousness has or performs a function. Maybe it does. The point I'm making is a slightly different and subtler one, which is to explain consciousness, it's not sufficient simply to explain those functions. You've got to explain why the performance of those functions is accompanied by experience. So to illustrate this, we'll just look very briefly at a couple of examples of theories of consciousness in the literature. There's the Crick and Koch theory of consciousness, or proto-theory, that invokes certain neuronal oscillations in the cortex in the 40 to 70 hertz range, and suggests this as the substrate for consciousness and the key to understanding, perhaps as the key to understanding consciousness. But if you look at this kind of theory in detail, I think what you see is, and what this kind of theory might explain, well, it seems to be a theory that might be well suited for explaining certain things like the binding of certain informational contents, the way that certain contents can be brought together for use in the generation of behavior. What's not addressed anywhere, it seems, in this framework is why these contents, in fact, are experienced. And why should these 40 hertz oscillations in the visual cortex be the kind of thing that should give rise to, say, to visual experience as opposed just to visual information processing? It strikes me that that's not addressed anywhere in their framework. And I think actually that I don't think Crick and Koch claim to be giving an explanation of experience, just of some of the processing mechanisms. But when we ask the question of, well, why does this give rise to experience, there seems to be what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap. The explanation goes so far, it goes as far as an explanation of some of the mechanisms, some of the functions, some of the behaviors, and then it stops. The question about experience is a further unanswered question. We can contrast this with examples like the DNA gene case, where there doesn't seem to be an explanatory gap. In those cases, we explain the relevant functions, and we've done all the explanatory work we need. That's what makes the problem of consciousness hard. Another example, briefly, is the example of Bernard Barr's global workspace theory of consciousness, which Goldman just talked about. If you look at what this theory might explain, it's a great, very interesting potential theory of how it is that certain information contents are brought together into a global workspace and made accessible to all kinds of different parts of the cognitive mechanism, broadcast, if you like, for access in the control of verbal behavior, other kinds of behavior, and thus explains a certain kind of the integration of cognition in a very nice way. But nothing in Barr's theory addresses the crucial question of, well, why is it that when contents get into this global workspace, are they experienced? It seems on the face of it that all this processing can happen in the absence of experience. There's a further question there that's unanswered. So I think this, in looking at the different approaches that we can take in understanding some of these reductive explanatory methods with respect to consciousness, we can come to a framework for kind of interpreting some of the later work that we're going to see of this consciousness, and some choices. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of people doing neural and computational and very straightforward cognitive explanations. And it'd be interesting to see, people commit themselves in some way to exactly what it is that they're claiming for their explanations, and the way that they're to be viewed within the larger project of explaining the hard problem, experience. Okay, the first choice, right, is, well, we're not going to bother with that hard problem for now. That's just a little bit too hard. We'll explain something else. We'll explain one of the easy problems. Well, my theory is an explanation of reportability, or of internal access, or of the self-concept, or something. Now, this is a perfectly valid and reasonable approach. It's very worthy, Within the framework of most of cognitive science, this is a very ambitious and interesting endeavor. I think it's one of the most... These issues are among the most interesting unsolved problems within cognitive science. On the other hand, within the framework of this conference in particular, perhaps that's just a little on the unambitious side, and that it doesn't address the question which we're really interested in, which is the question of how is it that a physical subject could be a subject of experience. I actually suspect that probably more than half the papers at this conference are going to fall within this category. So this isn't to demean this project at all. It's an interesting project, but it may explain why it is that at the end of some of these sessions, there's always a nagging question. Yeah, but what about consciousness? Next slide. Some people take a harder line, a harder approach here. They say, well, once we've explained all these functions, we've really explained all there is to explain. And someone like Dan Dennett takes a line more or less like this. We give a theory that can explain discrimination, reportability, and so on. If you look at actually the bulk of Dennett's book, the key part of Dennett's book, it's really an explanation of our verbal report mechanisms, how it is that they can report certain aspects of our internal states. And then at the end of the day, they say, well, we've explained everything. Well, what is this residue you're talking about, this experience nonsense? And the trouble with this is it does seem to just be a kind of a sort of scientific leisure, solution by leisure domain. It denies one of the key explananda, in fact, perhaps the very key explananda, the very central explananda in a theory of consciousness. It denies what's perhaps the most central and manifest aspect of our mental lives, and for that reason it's implausible and unsatisfactory, or at least without extraordinarily good arguments that lead us to suppose that this thing, consciousness, is an unreferring term, or something that's analogous to phlogiston. In the absence of those arguments, and this strategy just falls a long way short of any kind of satisfactory theory. Now, to be fair, Dennett does give some arguments in the last part of his book. I think that they can fairly straightforwardly be seen to fail, but I don't have time to get into that now, so I have to leave that for another day. Some other people might take a different version of this line and say, we've explained everything there is to explain. We believe in experience and the full thing, and we've explained that too by our reductive theory. Usually, though, these claims are sometimes made, but the relevant step usually looks just a little bit like magic. Suddenly, here's a theory, and it's declared a theory of experience. So if people want to make those claims, it would be interesting to see the very key step specified explicitly. Perhaps the next slide. A third strategy, another entirely reasonable strategy, is to say, well, what I'm doing here isn't addressing the question directly of how it is that a physical system could be a subject of experience. Rather, the claim is, well, we're explaining the substrate of experience, a processing substrate experience from which experience arises. Now, this, I think, is a very reasonable strategy. And it does, I think, offer the promise of a significantly rich and understanding of consciousness, but it is, of course, seriously incomplete. There's the question, why should this processing substrate be the kind of thing that should give rise to experience? And incidentally, the step is also sometimes unjustified when you look at these accounts. Why is it that this kind of the claim that this kind of processing is indeed the substrate of experience often relies on some prior assumptions about the kind of thing that's required for consciousness that are perhaps philosophical or methodological assumptions, or sometimes just intuitive assumptions that aren't as spelled out as well as they could be. But in any case, I think for a full scientific account of consciousness, we want a bit more than this. We want an account of the link, of how it is that this gives rise to consciousness. Otherwise, we're just leaving a key part of the question unanswered. So next slide. Okay, so the moral is, you can't explain conscious experience on the cheap. There are some things in life that you can't explain on the cheap. It seems that there's a real sense in which you can explain, say, biology or genetics or life even on the cheap in terms of physics. You don't need to invoke anything fundamentally new to get genetics from physical mechanisms. It's the right physical mechanisms combining in the right way. Reductive explanation seems to work well in, say, in biology and in certain parts of cognitive science. It doesn't seem to work though. This kind of reductive explanation just doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that works for consciousness. I mean, it would be great if it did. It would be wonderful. It would make life a lot easier. But this is why consciousness is a problem. This is why it's a hard problem. So I just don't think it does work. Now, some people at this stage want to say, well, let's just give up. Consciousness is too hard. Perhaps it's not even an appropriate subject matter for science. We're going to remain mystified by it forever. We should just accept it. Now, I think this is just gratuitously pessimistic. Just because a problem isn't easy doesn't mean it's unsolvable. I think it does mean we have to broaden our vision of what works. I think consciousness is certainly a part of nature. It's a perfectly reasonable natural phenomenon, and it ought to be governed by natural law. So, in the same way that everything in the universe is. So we just need to broaden our vision of explanation and look for a new, broader kind of explanation. So, what we really need in our theories is an extra ingredient over and above these purely reductive, process-oriented components. So this is what amounts to a challenge to those who really are claiming to give a serious theory of conscious experience at this conference. Well, what is your extra ingredient? And how is it that this extra ingredient is going to be the kind of thing that should explain consciousness? I mean, there are all kinds of extra ingredients out there that people are likely to appeal to. Now, I'm sure there are people who are going to want to invoke, say, dynamical systems or chaos or non-computational processes, particularly spiffy new developments in neuroscience. The question is always going to be, I mean, these things, wonderful as they are, they just seem to give you new and more interesting explanations of processes and of functions and of how these functions might be performed. For all of these things, the question, why should that kind of dynamic or non-computational process give rise to experience arises just as strongly as it did in the original case, say, of computation. Some people want to invoke quantum mechanics, but even there it seems that the process is, the same question arises. Why should this kind of quantum process, non-local as it might be, non-algorithmic as it might be, why should that be the kind of thing that should give rise to and explain experience? The explanatory gap seems to arise as strongly as ever. So, okay, next slide. My strategy is to take seriously the idea that the study of consciousness in some ways is going to be more like the study of physics. It's going to be more like physics than biology, in that it invokes a fundamental part of nature. Sometimes in science, usually in physics, you do have to take certain things as fundamental and not to be sort of explained reductively in terms of more basic things. Physics, for instance, invokes space-time, mass energy, and charge, so as fundamental, and then gives a theory of these things by giving an explanation of relations between various kinds of fundamental entities in terms of fundamental laws, and brings everything else out as a consequence. So the idea is that for consciousness, maybe we can move on to the next slide. For consciousness, we're going to have to invoke something else fundamental to see what's really going on with consciousness. Perhaps not invoke consciousness itself, as fundamental, but it invokes something new, some kind of proto-phenomenology, if you like, which is something over and above physics, and which will then explain consciousness. I think one way to see why this might be necessary is it seems that everything in physics is compatible with the absence of consciousness. We can imagine, metaphorically I can add, we can imagine God creating the world, creating all the physical stuff in the world, the distribution of all the fundamental particles and forces and waves and fields in space-time. And then God has now done almost all the work that God needs to do, right? Once you've created all these particles and so on, you've got all the lecterns and the tables and the chairs, they come along for free. And it seems that, say, life comes along for free in a certain sense too, once you've created all that physical stuff. Consciousness, it seems, doesn't come along for free. You need something extra, and this is why there's a suspicion that you need to invoke something new and fundamental for consciousness. And I should say, consciousness on this view, it's still perfectly reasonable to say that it arises from the physical. I think there's no doubt that my conscious experience arises from the brain. But we need certain basic, fundamental psychophysical principles to explain how. And incidentally, seeing as we are invoking new fundamental principles here, I think it's appropriate to adopt the kind of strategies that work in looking for fundamental principles in physics, principles such as simplicity and beauty, and the kind of things that, precisely because these laws are going to be the kind of thing that are in the basic furniture of the universe, something to be in the basic furniture of the universe, has to meet some pretty strong constraints, I think. So moving on to the next slide. I've got a theory of consciousness, or the beginning of the theory of consciousness that I introduced in an upcoming book. And unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about this at any length, but just outline it very briefly. So my approach is to look at what are these principles that connect to the basic entities of physics with conscious experience. You think of these as psychophysical laws, if you like. This may begin to sound a little bit crazy and loopy, but it's just the invocation of further new laws of nature that fall within a naturalistic, law-governed framework, just as the rest of science does. I start by looking at certain non-basic, high-level principles that connect experience and physical processing. And these really all require significant argument that I won't have a chance to get here. But one of them, starting with the second one first, is a principle of organizational invariance. The consciousness is what we might call an organizational invariant. Systems that share the same causal organization will have the same properties of conscious experience. So if the causal organization of my brain is duplicated, say in a silicon medium or in some other medium, then there's good reason to believe that will share exactly the same properties of conscious experience, if the organization is right. Now that really takes some argument to establish, and some people dispute it, but I think there's good reason to believe that's true. A second, more detailed, non-basic principle is a principle of structural coherence between the content of consciousness and what I call the content of awareness, where awareness is understood in a more processing-oriented, mechanistic sense. It does seem striking that if we examine the structure of my consciousness, the structure of my visual field, there's various distinctions that are made between colors, between objects in my visual field and so on. All those distinctions, those structural distinctions, are mirrored in my processing. The kind of discriminations that my perceptual system makes, those distinctions are mirrored in the distinctions within my consciousness. So I think there's reason to postulate an above and across the board principle of structural coherence between the structure of processing and the structure of experience. And once we've got these two non-basic principles into place, these already give us a kind of a broadened understanding of consciousness. But what we really want, though, for a fundamental theory, is a theory of the fundamental laws by which these non-basic principles can arise. These two principles which I see have disappeared, they're a little bit too high level to be part of the basic furniture of the world, I guess. They invoke high-level notions such as organization and structure of awareness. We really want the basic laws that explain those, just so we have basic laws that explain the high-level regularities in physics. Now, my basic principle, the one I like to invoke, is a kind of double aspect theory of information. And very briefly, on this theory, the notion is that information, what's taken as fundamental, is information, and more or less in the sense that goes back to Chalmers, but developed in certain ways. Whenever certain distinctions are made within physical processing and carried on down a causal chain, there's information present. And the theory postulates that information has two basic aspects. a physical aspect and what we can call a phenomenal aspect. We take this as fundamental, and from then it seems that in a certain way, with a lot of elaboration, we can recover the basic structure and the theory of consciousness. And it will follow, for instance, that the complex structure of consciousness arises precisely from the complex structure of information and the information processing within the brain. Given this kind of information processing, and given this fundamental double aspect principle, that information has these two aspects, we can then predict the complex structure of experience. And this arises precisely because of this basic law of nature. So we can see in this way that the consciousness is a natural phenomenon, purely law governed, as part of nature. Just we have to expand our view of what the basic laws of nature are to handle consciousness. I at least find this fairly plausible. So I guess I'm just about done. And just moving on to the last slide. If you want to hear more about this, I've got a book coming out next year from MIT Press. It's called Toward a Theory of Consciousness, that elaborates, the first half of it basically elaborates the negative arguments that I've concentrated on here, of what kind of explanation just doesn't work. The second half of it really elaborates this positive framework at much more length. So if you're interested in that, take a look at the book. If you can't wait until then, come and ask me and I can probably send you a copy or something. So thanks.